Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. I've learned in this season that the early peopling patterns of North America were extremely complex and in no way linear. It seems that the vast majority of the evidence for Clovis and pre-Clovis users is actually much further south than the ice sheets, and in fact is now underwater. Today I'm talking to Dr. Michael Faught, who is a retired academic but an active consultant in CRM. He and Dr. Charlotte Pevny published a wide-ranging paper in PALEOAMERICA on the expansion and settlement in Florida up to the early Archaic period. Unfortunately, Charlotte is out in the field, but welcome, Michael. This was a period of climate change and sea level rise, which meant the expansion of human occupation was very much dependent on the shrinking habitable land. So can you fill me in on the background to this research and what you were trying to achieve?
The aims of the paper was to publish a talk that was given in Argentina in 2017. Charlotte was invited to this international symposium on nappable materials. Charlotte is an expert in use-wear analysis of chipstone. She's a good flint napper too, I might add. I was already talking about going down there to meet people and to understand more about South American archaeology. The similarities between Florida and Argentina are there, and others have talked about it. So I gave this presentation, and the presentation really follows, and the paper as well, this structure of this story that has been built in Florida archaeology over many years. In 1964, Sears of Florida archaeologists published that there wasn't any Paleoindian in Florida because obviously everybody knows Paleoindians coming from, Alaska, and so that's where it's got to be. Well, it turns out all at that same time, the river divers in Florida have been coming up with just oodles of material out of the karst rivers, so it's karstic. It doesn't carry sand. It's not the same thing as a fast-moving river. There's slow-moving rivers. There's springs all over it. Very different. And there's chipstone, there's toolstone all over the northern part of the state of Florida. So it's just water, animals, toolstone. It's a good draw for people. Well, anyway, it turns out nowadays we know that not only is there a significant signal of Clovis technology, but then an increasing later Paleoindian, what we call Swanee points, and then at the late Pleistocene, early Holocene. We're talking about the time frame of the Younger Dryas. So Clovis begins right at the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas ends at 11,500 years ago. So right then, we get a lot of sites in Florida seem to show up with a particular kind of projectile point. No doubt related to Clovis, but not at all similar. It's a notch point, a small thing. And so that's at 11,500. And then we know that those sites, there's a lot we could talk about the distribution of the sites in Florida that are Paleoindian Clovis related, are mostly to the north down to about Tampa Bay. A lot of sites. Some of the sites are really big. A lot of woodworking tools. Not 25 people walking around with very few things, eating here and there. It's more of a settled environment. It's a lot of population. It's a ton of chipstone. These people are just napping rock left and right and left and right. So now the story goes is that my part of the story, it's that some don't agree with, is that by about 10,000 years ago or so, give or take a couple hundred years, those people seem to be gone. There's like a hiatus in time where the sites begin later. The sites that are later, particularly this Wendover burial site, has a very different stone tool and bone tool assemblages that are really different. So it's my belief and experience with sites that people that were there in Florida for those thousands of years making these particular kinds of points left and probably came to the north. They didn't go south. And that's where we see a lot more activity of these notch point peoples. But there's a lot of interaction that's taking place in the east and stuff, particularly through time. And this is reflected in Florida with, different populations moving around. They're all still Amerindian genetically, they're all still Indians from the original group.
And where does the rising sea fit into their story?
What we know now more is that at Page Ladson, we have people in Florida at 14,500 years ago. And that's actually kind of an interesting time frame because at 14,400 is the first of 3 meltwater pulses. So we're real interested in Florida and sea level rise because there's a big continental shelf, which is part of this paper, by the way. And the subject matter is what's the distribution of people? And half of the state is gone. that was there at that particular time. So these meltwater pulses happen at 14,400, and around the continents of America, 14,000 is not an uncommon number to see in the radiocarbon records for what are proposed as pre-Clovis sites. Page Ladson would be one right around that time period. Monteverde down in South America would be right around that time period. Yeah, Paisley Caves up in the north. I mean, ones that I would consider, convincing sites that are early. That 14K seems to be kind of a number that has relevance. Then there's a second meltwater pulse. That's the big one. That happens at 11,500 years ago. Of the paper we're working on, that's what we were kind of trying to get an idea of is, well, if we know that a certain amount of landscape was covered by the sea level rise, big western continental shelf, in the first meltwater pulse, but then a whole lot of it in the second meltwater pulse, and then a third meltwater pulse around 8,000 years ago, which, by the way, is probably that biblical flood that overran the Bosphorus, in Europe. And by the way, one of the things we were trying to figure out is, well, if we had a certain amount of space and we estimated a certain number of sites within that space, and that was kind of a population estimate in that regard, then how many would we expect if it was the same percentage that just moved on land because they were shoved in the second meltwater pulse? And it turns out, well, by our estimates, no, there's a lot more people even than that. And nobody's criticized the research yet. It would be useful to have somebody. It's probably not correct. It might be getting near. It's certainly a way to start thinking about what happens with the sea level rise, particularly in Florida, big western continental shelf.
Right, so you had people moving about, land disappearing under the sea, people moving further north, and an increased population. How do you make sense of all of this in Florida?
So the data sets in Florida that we work with are twofold. One is the Florida State Master Site File has accumulated geographic positions on all the sites that have been found in Florida from early days to the modern ones, because a lot of sites are being added with cultural resource management. And Florida has one of the best that I'm familiar with of states for CRM and for research. So we have positions of sites, dots on the map, that are associated with these time frames. And some of them with multiple time frames. Some of them aren't very, very trustworthy. In fact, Jesse Halligan, who's at Florida State University, has recently gone through these data more precisely and has weeded out. So it's a cleaner database. And so the numbers of sites then, so we've got, Swanee sites, we've got Clovis, and so on and so forth. And we can see this increasing numbers of sites through time.
Are the sites well dated?
There's no good control on Clovis ages in Florida or Swanee, the later Paleoindian. We don't get radiocarbon ages after the pre-Clovis in Page Ladson at 14,000, whatever, 5, maybe 14,4. Then we don't get any more. We don't get radiocarbon until this 11,500, and then we got a lot. There's quite a bit of. There's several sites that have been dated at the same time frame. In fact, Charlotte is well known for one up in Tallahassee that she dug for the Goodwin and Associates called LE2105. It's a Leon County number for the site. It had tools, it had points, it had big camps, fire pits, radiocarbon ages, and they may be related, the same group, through time. There seems to be an evolution of shapes from the lanceolates to these corner notch, but these are all questions of time.
And that's not the only collection of evidence, is it?
The second database is collectors, in particular one collector in Florida. My good colleague and friend David Thulman has done work inventorying the Paleoindian points that have been found by river divers. You could it's used to be legal and now it's not. But Dave had a good sample of it. And then there was a collector down in Silver Springs, Florida. He's a wealthy individual. He's collected numerous collections of these legally collected samples, thousands of artifacts. So the instance, the Boland points, these notch points that are in Florida I'm talking about, that are after 11,500. The Rainey collection has numbers of Clovis points and numbers of Swanee points and numbers of these notch points. And because these collections have come together and the sample number is so high, 50 some thousands of artifacts. And so that is a way to compare the idea. This is where some of the population stuff came from in terms of, well, we've got this number of points at this time frame. And so that's what we spread out into the estimates on the offshore. Sites have been found offshore.
Yeah, are there lots of offshore sites as well?
But my dissertation work actually traced out the Paleo-Oscilla, which is where Page Ladson is. In the Big Bend of Florida, if you look at a map, the Big Bend, the Oscilla comes out right in the middle of it. And I traced that out. We found sites out to 9 miles, nautical miles, in as much as 20 feet of water. The number of sites that I published on in my dissertation was on between 12 and 15 feet of water of these time frames. Swanee points, there was Clovis, there was the Notch points, all out on the onshore. So how far out sites go, whether these people were coastally adapted or not, avenues for research.
All right, so let's get into some of these sites. What's the nature of the evidence in Florida?
Probably the one that comes to mind the first is down in Tampa Bay called Harney Flats. Down in Tampa Bay, there's a lot, dots on the map all over the place of these early sites. Not a lot of Clovis, not so much Swanee later stuff, but fair amount, and then a bunch of the Notch points and stuff. It's typical distribution. And a lot of chipped stone down there, tool stone sources. Chert, the limestone that's all Florida, the chert is where that tool stone comes from. It's very popular. Some of the best in the state of Florida is there in Tampa Bay. Not in the bay, but out offshore on the west side. Harney Flats is one of the few sites that has the lanceolate late Paleoindian Swanees mixed with the notched point, Bolin points that come just later. It's estimated that the Swanee should be lower and the notch points should be higher, but they're too intermixed at Harney to really call it. There's a site now that Morgan Smith out of University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, worked on for his dissertation. It's the Ryan Harley site, and it's up in the Oscilla Basin, up to the north part of the state. And that has nothing but Swanee tools and points, which is important because whenever we find Swanee points, there's usually a bunch of notch points around. And so it's like getting them separated is a real chore. That Ryan Harley is the best place. Everybody likes it. There's tools, and it's like, oh, this is clearly just Swanee stuff. But no ages, all the bone was too mineralized. That's a big problem in Florida. Mineralization in the rivers just, pretty fast.
So is there datable material?
The Page Ladson site starts with this bed that's mastodon dung, that even some of it, when we were excavating back in the early days, it had roundness of the plots and stuff that you could see as you were going down. And that stuff with that bed is where the Pre-Clovis is. And that bed is between 15,000 at the bottom, and then up in the middle, 14.5, and then pretty much 14 right at the top. And then there's a big time of sedimentation at Page Ladson where there's no artifacts much. And then at the very top is a soil developed on this mud, this gray mud. And on that surface, we found in 87 notch points on the surface of this dirt. Oh, by the way, we're in the river and we're about 16 feet deep in the water. And we've excavated down another 2 meters and stuff. So we're down into this big hole that we've dug. So this surface then had pegs, some split wood, radiocarbon, all over the place. It's one of the earliest places in Florida. So that's a really important stratigraphic scenario. And then in that same area in Florida in the north, Perry, Florida, what's called Bird Lake or Ross Bay. We're talking millions of artifacts. This is where there were these Oscilla adzes, which are these unifacial adzes that are chipped stone, and they're hafted. They're unifacial, so it's a big flake, and then it's been chipped so that there's an edge to it. Different kinds of scrapers, a lot of evidence for woodworking or bone working. That was a huge site. The point that I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of material at this time frame. It's not just hit and miss, it's a lot of material.
CRM in the last 20 years or so, that must have added a huge volume to the evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Genie's Betterback is a site that was south of Tallahassee, and that was dug by archaeological levels, and they found tools of this Bolin age and no Swanee to be associated with it. That was a big site that was found by Cultural Resource Management, very important and published on, because there's a guy named Bob Austin that's in Florida, and he's a Cultural Resource Management archaeologist that's been around the Tampa Bay area since the mid-'80s, and he's published quite a bit. That's actually a very honorable thing. There's not so many cultural resource managers stay up all night to make publications as you would as an academic. Boston does do that, and so there's quite a bit of work come out of the Tampa Bay region. So I'm focused on this late Pleistocene, early Holocene time frame, but Florida has more archaeology through time than any other state I know. It's got Pre-Clovis, and it's got Clovis, and it's got Swanee, and then it's got Bolin, and then the Bolin kind of goes away, and there's a little hiatus right there, but now you got Kirk, and in Florida, collectors have pieces from all of those.
And now that you've interrogated all this evidence, what's the narrative that you can start to develop?
So I think the most important part is what we said in the title, descent with modification. So what's an interesting task and actually has relevance to the peopling of the New World, or the Americas, in terms of recognizing archaeological culture groups that evolve through time and our ability to say, this one comes from that one comes from. And ultimately, the peopling of the New World, there's basically 4 male Y chromosomes, mostly Q, mostly one kind. And then there's 7 mitochondrial haplogroup women. And those people have been together for at least 18,000 years, somewhere in that zone and stuff. So when we say this one's related to that one, it's like, well, at the bottom, they're all related to each other. So it's a matter of trying to piece out how it really works. Another issue is that the Swanee points are lanceolate points, and the Bolin points are little notch points that are totally different shapes and stuff. It's like, well, how do you identify those as the same people? And the answer is, when they made the Bolin points, when they made their biface preforms to get it down, they have to, you got a big flake, and then you start working it down, and now it's smaller, and now you make an arrowhead. Well, they would flute that biface preform as like an homage, or just the way it's been done. So by that tool or that behavior, we really target the relationship with Clovis. We know Clovis was there. These guys are still fluting their biface preforms as a marker. All the tools so far that we know would be really useful if we could distinguish which ones are Swanee and which ones are Bolin, but all the tools are mostly Bolin that we found so far in terms of the tools, except that Ryan Harley site that I mentioned, where there's some very small tools, scrapers and ladsy things. Those people had a lot of stuff. Surely they had houses, surely they had baskets, clothing.
You spent a lot of your career mapping underwater and offshore. So in developing that narrative, what kind of questions do you need to ask next?
Well, I have colleagues and ex-students that are gotten a couple of grants now to work on the offshore in the same place that I did. They're going to be actually from the Michael hurricane. They've gotten money from the federal government through Florida to do inventory and see how my sites fared, because we have quite a bit of information about those submerged sites that I found in the 80s, early 90s, and then when I got the job in Florida from the late 90s into the 2000s. I had a lot of money, and I had boats, and I had students, enthusiastic students, and so we got a lot of survey done. There's really quite a bit of work that was done out there. And so those guys are following up on that, including, by the way, this notion that in underwater archaeology, remote sensing is a big deal. Mapping, trying to figure out what the landscape was before, what it is afterwards. Big issue. And the west coast of Florida, the western continental shelf of Florida is absolutely part of that, query. So side scan sonar, like shipwreck people use, can map where the rocks are. That's how I found many sites. We use side scan sonar, but we could reconstruct where the paleo channels were. And we had sub-bottom profilers, which are seismic devices that, like the oil people use to see stratigraphic stuff. And so we did a bunch of that work. Well, it turns out now that these guys are working on the people, my colleagues, this would be Sean Joy and Morgan Smith, by the way, and some others. It turns out the Danes have found this out, that sub-bottom profiler, when it goes over the flint or chert that's been napped, it reflects up into the water. We've sampled now 13 places, and every time he dives on that, there's chipstone artifacts there and stuff. And that's a big deal. And then another colleague, Dave Thoman, who I mentioned before, has been working, and I've been there with him a couple of years, in Lake George, which is in the St. Johns River on the east side of Florida that flows north. This Lake George, had a Swanee site. Remember I mentioned this, the lanceolate's big Swanee site. Hardly any of I don't think there were any, in fact, bowling points there and stuff, underwater in the lake on the northeastern side of the lake. So while chasing after that Swanee stuff to see if they could find more, Dave and colleagues did a bunch of remote sensing and been coring, and the cores have now shown up at the bottom where we expected there to be dry land because the sea level's all down. It should be dry. We found a big marshy swamp environment with the cores. Dave did. And the radiocarbon ages are 19K, 16K, all in the pre-Clovis zone. So Dave's going back. He's going for a proposal now from state of Florida. State of Florida really supports archaeology. They have grants every year, and the Archaeological Research Cooperative, of which I'm a part, has been very successful in supporting proposals and then actually getting grant funding and stuff to do this work.
And where would you like to see underwater mapping more widely in the Americas? Where do you see the big growth areas in the future?
There's more research. The Canadians are doing research up in the Northwest Coast. They're really looking for the coastal migration. Southern California, there's a really good project going on in the Catalina Islands. What used to be called Santa Rosa. It used to be one big, when the sea levels were down, it was a much bigger place. They're doing some coring and stuff there, early peopling there. There's a couple of things going on. There's in Chile. There's a project right now with a paleontological find underwater. They don't have human site yet, but they're looking. And then also in Argentina, Uruguay, there's stuff going on in the intertidal. But the place to go do underwater archaeology where you're going to find important stuff is the Atlantic continental shelf, particularly also the Chesapeake Bay, because Chesapeake is clearly, this is the heartland of density, of numbers, and diversity of fluted points, which is an indicator biologically of its source. There's pre-Clovis sites, particularly the Parsons Island site. It looks like 17 to 20,000. It's really early in this stuff. But I hope Lothrop talked a little bit about that. It would be very important. That site's going to be important in the long run. But my point is that doing submerged prehistoric archaeology in the Chesapeake Bay, if I was a young buck, that's where I'd go. It's a challenge because most of the people in the East Coast and the eastern part of the United States are focused on historic issues or proto-historic Indian issues and stuff. Very few academic researchers focused on the early peopling because it's not expected there. Even though the sites are accruing, it's really early. It's like that's not where it's expected. We need more researchers. That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah, it sounds like we need a lot more research in the eastern states. Thank you for joining me today, Michael Faught. All the papers we've talked about today are detailed on the website. So that brings us to the end of this episode of Foreign Countries. Join me next time for another conversation.